Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Sharper Angle event. What is next for corporate communications in 2021? We are joined right now by attendees from across the Twin Cities to the UK, from Toronto to Latvia. Welcome, everybody. I'm Paul Maccabee. I'm president of Maccabee Public Relations in Minneapolis, and I'm thrilled to introduce three corporate communications icons. We have with us today Molly Snyder, currently the Chief Communications Officer for Shipt. Molly is also the former SVP of Communications for US Bank, VP of Communications for Optum, and the former Communications Director for Target Corporation. We also have Fernando Vivanco. He is currently the head of Global Comms for TE Connectivity, but he's also the former Senior Director of Corporate Communications for Medtronic and the former Director of Global Business and Internal Communications for Honeywell. And with a Interstellar background, we have Whitney McChane. She is currently the VP of Communications for Interstellar and the former VP of Marketing Communications for International Dairy Queen, the home of the Blizzard. Some quick housekeeping before we begin our panel discussion on corporate communications in 2021. First, please mute yourselves. We love you, but we don't want to hear your puppies. We will be recording this entire program, and everybody who is listening will receive a link in a couple of days to that recording so you can watch it again or share it with your coworkers. If you have questions for any of our three panelists, please submit them in the chat box, and we will get to those questions as soon as we can with Whitney, Fernando, and Molly. We'll spend the first 20 or 25 minutes in conversation with our three panelists, followed by questions and answers, and then we will wrap things up at about 12:45 or so. And now, Molly, Fernando, and Whitney, welcome, and let's begin. We'll start with a lightning round. And Molly, maybe we'll begin with your answer. What is your number one concern as a corporate communications leader in this 2021 year? And beyond your greatest concern, what is your greatest hope for the coming year of 2021?
Great question, and great to be here. Thanks for having me. So I think I'd say my top concern right now is just fatigue. Communicators have been at the tip of the spear for a year now. And we're always at the tip of the spear, but we really have been during COVID. And I think people are just tired. And so really, both across our teams and our organizations, finding ways to bring energy back, to bring optimism back is absolutely one of the things we think and talk a lot about. I think the thing I'm most excited about is that the rules have all changed. And so, I have never craved going back to what we had before. Certainly there will be things that we did much better that we can't do now, but I'm really excited to continue to be able to say, okay, we all survived and in many ways thrived over the past year. And so what do we get to do now? And so I think that's the exciting part.
That's great. Thank you, Molly. Fernando, what's your answer about your number one concern as a corporate communications leader for the coming year? And what are you praying will occur in the new year?
Well, I have many concerns. I wouldn't say my number one, but one I think about often right now is, allowing workers to work from home over the past years had some pros and cons, right? But I think one concern I continue to have is, with many employees being able to work from home, is how do we ensure that our employees' relationship with our company is more than a transactional relationship, right? Because if you look at when you're in an office environment, you can sort of build a sense of culture, community, camaraderie, teamwork, et cetera. And so the challenge for us, that I have at TE Connectivity is, how do we create more of that stickiness between the company and our employees, which will actually help with employee retention, for example, and also employee recruitment. So I think it's more important for companies today to have a really strong purpose, and from a communications perspective, be more deliberate in really trying to elevate our communications to that higher purpose, right? Along with that, it's ensuring that we have the right digital tools to engage with our employees, being a lot more deliberate about how we think of our employees as an audience. So if you think about, from an external perspective and customers, companies tend to do a pretty good job with creating personas and mapping out their journeys. And are we taking that similar approach with employees, especially in this remote environment? I think that that's growing it continues to grow in importance from my perspective.
Excellent, outstanding, Fernando. Whitney, your greatest concern in this year as a CorpCom lead, and what are you praying for? What are you hoping for?
So my greatest concern is that this light at the end of the tunnel will somehow be shut off. I think we've all been working toward this opportunity to be vaccinated and resume some sense of normalcy, and it feels within reach. But then occasionally, as I hear about these super variants, it is concerning that something will happen and bring us back and regress, us back to a place that was really challenging on companies, on employees, all around. But my greatest hope is that there's been so much positive that has come out of this from the perspective of communications. We have propelled forward by 5-10 years in some disciplines, just in our ability to, in a modern way, engage our staff and engage consumers and key stakeholders. And so my hope is that we harness that energy and continue this positive forward momentum and don't allow this positive resumption of normalcy to slow down what have been really considerable gains in modern marketing.
That's fantastic. So let's stay on working remotely because it's such a reality, and yet there's obviously a push for return to work in some hybrid form for most corporations. Maybe starting with you, Fernando, many of your company's employees are probably working remotely. How has the reality and the dispersal, the decentralization of your employee base, how has that affected your job in corporate communications in the past year and going forward?
Yeah, well, Paul, we have about 80,000 employees all around the world. And if you look at our employee population, we have a large base of employees that work in a factory environment that are not connected to email, that don't have access to your company laptop. And so what we do is we rely on people managers and HR leaders to reach out to them from a communications perspective. We've also been deliberately building a network of communications champions to help ensure that we deliver a lot of these messages to our employees who continue to go to work today in light of the pandemic because they are deemed essential, and a lot of the work that we do is very critical to critical infrastructure. But from employees that are working remote, we're really trying to lead more with that digital communications. One example, we've rolled over the last couple of years. We've rolled out an app, and we have many of our employees, more than 20,000 of our employees using the app every quarter, or on a monthly basis. Along with that, we have more than 500 employees, not communicators, but employees that we have trained as content creators for the app. And so they're able to sort of take a lot of the content that we've created at a macro level and really try to localize it or centralize it. We do a lot of digital signage with our employees around the world. But I think, again, the challenge for us and what we're really trying to move more toward is that brand differentiation. It's how do we, because as we look at more of an online experience, whether it's employees or customers, that personal interaction is less frequent. So I think people are looking for, who can they trust as an employer, as a partner? What does your brand stand for today? Many want to know more about what your company stands for in terms of, things such as diversity and inclusion, for example, sustainability, lots of many other issues right now. So I think that there's more of an opportunity for companies to continue to differentiate themselves. But also, as Whitney touched on a little bit, there's also fatigue, there's screen fatigue. I think from a communications perspective, people want to be more entertained, right? They want, and so there's shorter time spans, and there's more of a requirement for us as communicators and companies to be a lot more creative, to cut through the clutter, to break through, have more of that breakthrough thinking in order to be able to stand out. That's not just with our customers, but also with our employees as well.
That's great. Thank you, Fernando. Molly, how has work from home affected your role at Shipt as a corporate communicator, and not just with employees, internal, but also perhaps customers, clients, vendors, everybody else who is working from home? How does it affect your job as in CorpCom?
Sure. So if you're not familiar with Shipt, we're a same-day delivery service. So as you can imagine, the past year, our business has scaled exponentially. What has also happened in that scaling is that at this point, about 45% of our employee base has come on board since COVID, myself included. So you have 1 out of every 2 employees has never met in person. They've never seen headquarters. They've never had the ability to do a hallway chat. And so I think our experience certainly is unique in that way, but I think it really amplifies some of the culture questions and challenges that organizations are now facing of who were we before? What do we want to keep? How do we keep the team engaged? And so that's a lot of what we're focused on from a team and internal communications. Then when you factor in thinking about some of what Fernando just talked about, when you have a base that is not your headquarters base, and for us that's really unique because these are gig contractor individuals, they are not employees. But hundreds of thousands of them have come on board since the beginning of COVID. They are not working from home. They're shopping the aisles at Target and Meijer across the country, but really helping make sure that as you scale that rapidly, that we are bringing what makes Shipt magical into their lives, into customer lives, into retail partner lives, all of that, sitting independently in our houses by ourselves. And so, I would say the headline for us is that we've been incredibly intentional about making sure that we're asking those questions as a part of everything that we do.
That's great, Molly. Whitney, you've had both B2C with your previous employer, Dairy Queen, and now I assume is Interstellar B2B?
So it's Unistellar, and we're B2C and B2B. So we sell products direct to consumers, and we also sell through distributors. And the experiences are very different. At Dairy Queen, you're talking about an 80-year legacy brand with a lot of existing processes, and something that happened quite quickly when we shifted to working from home was really rapid adoption of collaborative technologies like Teams. And it was a thing of beauty to see, to witness. And I'm no longer there, but I know that continues, the use of Teams. And at Unistellar, we use Slack. And I would say the difference in the Unistellar experience is you're looking at a tech startup. So we have fewer employees tackling more items. And so it really is kind of an always on function that rolls along with the time zone, where there's monitoring of activity, everything that could be defending against reputation attacks, to managing our shipments that are coming into the ports and could be turned away because medical supplies are being prioritized. There's a lot of still kind of bubbling crises that may be happening. And so, when you're working in this global environment, it's really essential to be frequently communicating and ensuring that you have a proper handoff when you move from time zone to time zone or person to person, so that you always know who's on first, and if and when the next issue bubbles up, who will be on point to tackle it. But to me, the greatest change has been this rapid adoption of these collaborative tools, which, brings us here today. Now we're all comfortable having this type of, pretty heavy conversation, but in a really lively room. And we are all excited about using Zoom for now.
That was great. Thank you, Whitney. So obviously there's a trial going on in downtown Minneapolis, and many corporations that did not have a director of diversity, perhaps most, have been hiring directors of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maybe Fernando, starting with you, how has, in the broadest sense, the reckoning with systemic racism, but also the awareness that corporations play a role, at least in employment, if not further, in dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, How has that reckoning and push affected you as a corporate communicator?
Yeah, no, thanks, Paul. Interesting question. I think it's interesting because we are a global company, and so trying to, you know, diversity and inclusion might mean something different in the U.S. than it would in Europe or Asia, right? And so it's not a one size fits all definition. But I think, if we look at the death of George Floyd and the protests and riots that we saw last summer, I do think that we've reached a tipping point, if we didn't already reach that, where the topic of racial inequality is really here to stay and will continue to grow in importance, right? So, I think that we're at a point where we're soon going to be approaching that point of more transparency and more accountability by companies around the topic of inclusion and diversity. Now, I think there's no doubt to communicate that companies need to take a stand and speak out on these topics. But you also have to balance that and make sure that you just aren't communicating platitudes, right? Because when you do that, companies can be seen as really trying to exploit the situation or the issue, and it could boomerang on you. I think that this year is probably will be a time for companies to walk the talk. And when I say that, I mean, don't get me wrong, communications is important, but I think that the real discussions that we need to have and raise as communicators is really more around those operational issues, the operational discussions. So for example, asking questions like, does leadership monitor metrics throughout the year to ensure that the company is making meaningful change, right, and meaningful progress, and we're being held accountable for those results? Are we looking at, what is the pay equity gap with ethnically diverse employees, comparing that by job title, for example? Mm-hmm. What's the percentage of women or ethnically diverse employees by title? How are those percentages changing year over year? How many of those are moving from, individual contributor level to manager to director, senior director to VP? Does your company have a supplier diversity strategy? Do you have relationships with historically Black colleges and universities, for example? What does your diversity recruitment strategy look like?
And Fernando, can I add? So what is your role, or Molly's role, or Whitney's role, or that of any of the CorpCom people, to communicate that in fact the company is taking those real world operational steps? Who gets the word out that yes, we are really paying attention to the metrics of hiring that we may not have done before? Is that corporate communications job?
I think it's in collaboration with other internal business partners, right? It's bringing that story together and telling that story that really has meat behind it, right? Telling the story internally with our employees, telling that story externally on a very regular basis through, your annual reports, your integrated reports, whatever companies have, telling that story consistently through social media as well. And, so I think saying that diversity and inclusion is important is one thing, but then it's more meaningful when you have a lot of those proof points to tell a more meaningful story.
Yep. Molly, how does the push for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the business sphere affect you in your job? How would you like to be involved in that conversation?
Yeah, I think what I've seen in the past year is, these were conversations and tables we were already at, but the conversation absolutely, rightfully so, shifted. And so I think what has been a role that I've seen us play in the past year has been getting comfortable with the fact that we're not perfect and nobody is, and thinking about communicating that differently. So all of the different metrics and everything that Fernando talks about are critical, and they will help us show progress. I think a lot of companies had been very reticent to own the imperfect parts of their story. And I think, what we've all seen come to life, a good thing that has come out of a really, really hard year and a true reckoning for our country and the business community has been that we all, have to now acknowledge that none of us were perfect and we are on a journey, and our job is to help articulate to our teams and to the community what that journey is and how we're going to measure progress.
Outstanding, Molly. Whitney, before I get to you, if any of our attendees want to go to the chat room and pose questions to all three of our panelists or any particular one on any of the topics we're dealing with, we'd welcome those questions. Whitney, let me shift for one moment and talk about, in a perfect world, if you could wave the Hogwarts magic wand, how do you want your senior leadership, particularly your CEO or your president, to view your role as a corporate communicator? How do you want, I hesitate to use the word your boss, male or female, but your CEO and president, when they hear the words, oh yeah, Whitney's our head of corporate communications, what do you want them to think of you as?
I want them to think my reputation is reliant on this person and their function, because that's really what it is. Whether you are proactively working to improve or maintain a positive reputation, or you're behind the scenes working hard to defend against potential threats, external or internal. It is the job of corporate communications to understand your key stakeholders and their vision of your business, and to set and maintain those expectations with your external stakeholders. You must always protect the reputation of the business. And so you really need leadership to see you as their most trusted reputation advisor and bring you into the fold early and often.
You have obviously thought about that, Whitney. Because it was visceral for you.
Oh boy, yes.
Molly, how do you want your president, CEO, senior leadership to view you, your role at Shipt?
Yeah, I think for me, it's simple. I'm the person who's going to tell them the truth. And they might not always like it. They might not always want to hear it, but you're going to get the truth from me.
Wow, that's great. Fernando, how do you want your leadership at TE to think of you and your role?
I was going to say more or less what Molly just said, and it's being, I've had many conversations with the CEO where you offer up counsel and advice, and there are many times where he's taken that advice, and many times where he has said, "Thank you for being thoughtful. I appreciate the thought process that you went through to get here. I'm going to go in a different direction." And that's fine. Once, I think it's the role of the CEO to listen to his or her, get counsel from many people. And then based on the information that he or she has and, make that right decision. So when he makes a decision that I may not have fully agreed with, I don't take it personally. But what I do is I get on board and find ways to support that from a communications perspective, right? And I think that earns, credibility with leadership over time as well.
Thank you, Fernando. So this is a broader question. One of you used the word brand reputation. I think it was you, Whitney. So truly dozens of corporations have found themselves dealing with politics, the culture wars, many of them being very apolitical themselves. You've got Dominion Systems, you've got Twitter, you've got the Children's Workshop of Sesame Street embroiled in a partisan controversy. You have the publishers of the Dr. Seuss books. You have Facebook, obviously, deeply involved. And then you've got MyPillow. But putting MyPillow aside, a lot of corporations, I wouldn't say have stumbled, but they have inadvertently touched a third rail, which is, shall we say, it's the partisanship of our nation. And I think sometimes the corporation, like maybe the Dr. Seuss folks, are shocked and surprised that there's suddenly tens of thousands of social media posts about a step that they took that I think perhaps they did not expect would be provocative or controversial. So in this environment that we are in, highly polarized, very sensitive, lots of cultural and political sensitivities. Whitney, to start with you, what is the role of a corporate communicator in helping a company, guiding a company to preserve its brand reputation when let's call it an inadvertent crisis rears its head?
First and foremost, have the difficult conversations before the difficult situations present themselves. You must know your brand, what you stand for, and what your stakeholders believe your brand stands for, so that when it comes to making sometimes difficult decisions, you can present a consistent presence and you can continuously deliver on expectations for your people. You look at Ben & Jerry's versus Chick-fil-A. They are on completely opposite ends and they're both extremely provocative, but they both know their brand and they consistently deliver on the expectations that they have set for their stakeholders. When you become embroiled in a crisis that you don't expect because what seems to be an apolitical position suddenly becomes heated, you need to know what your stakeholders' position will be and what your consumers or others are going to expect from you before, so that you can quickly understand how to navigate the situation. And, sometimes people make mistakes and then it's upon the brand to acknowledge, admit, learn, and move forward. But sometimes you have to take a position that will feel very contrary at the time, but that the brand will overcome and survive. So you need to know enough about your stakeholders and your brand to understand how much you push your position and how much you hold. It's a complicated conversation, but my best advice is to have the difficult conversations before you really need to have them.
Marvelous. And we get some questions, but I want to make sure, Molly and or Fernando, any thoughts about your roles or the broader corporate communications role when a crisis occurs that deals with politics in the broadest terms of people's personal politics and cultural sensitivities? Molly, Fernando, any particular things you want to add?
Yeah, Whitney shared a lot of what I would say as well. I think in situations like that, it is key to have defined what you already know are your greatest risks as a company. So, in particular, then if something pops, if it also is one of the areas where you have the greatest risk, then that elevates it even further. I think the other thing that I've really appreciated is ensuring that we are all surrounding ourselves on leadership teams and cross-functionally across organizations with incredible diversity of thought, because it's very, very hard for leaders that we are working with and supporting in those moments to not to tease out their own political beliefs when something is happening. And so by having that diversity, you're forced to really be more of a reflection of what's actually happening in the outside world. And so I think those are two key things for us.
Thank you, Molly. Fernando, I've got a shift for you, a question from John Austin, Crisis Communications Consultant.
Great.
So thank you, John. So John asks, and this is for you, Fernando, will it become an increasingly polarized commercial marketplace? Goya and MyPillow appear to have prospered by picking a side. So have other companies by picking sides like Ben & Jerry's, you mentioned, with progressive causes, Nike, for example. Is this the wave of the future for corporations and brands not to avoid taking a side and irritating some of their base, but in fact, to take a side and understand that there will be pain and glory in taking that side? What is your answer?
Yeah, no, I think, and thanks, John. Look, I think this isn't the first time you referenced Nike. I mean, Nike has taken positions that are viewed as controversial, but I think they've made those calculated decisions before going out with different positions. I think it's going to continue. I think, I think what it comes down to is a couple things. One is taking a position that's aligned with your company's purpose, right? And just being true to your company's purpose is absolutely key. And that's one piece. I think the other piece as part of that is understanding your audience, what resonates with them, and taking more of a data-driven approach as well. I've worked on issues and crises before where, you're sitting in a room and you have a lot of anecdotal information that is shared. And it's really powerful, more powerful when you have data to substantiate your position. So for example, I worked on an issue, and I won't go into what the issue was, where a senior leader said, oh my gosh, all of our customers are, freaking out about this. And it was very powerful to show, we had done focus groups, we had done surveys, and it showed that less than 1% of our customers were even aware of the issue. So yes, there was a lot of noise out in the system, but the core audience that was important to us, they didn't know about the issue. So had we all of a sudden changed a lot of our communications to address the issue that we thought was burning, we would have then created that, we would have elevated that topic with our key stakeholder customers that were 99% of them didn't even know about it. And now we would have introduced them into that topic. So I think, taking emotion out of an issue or crisis as much as possible through data, through understanding your audience, and really being true to your company's purpose, I think is very key for companies.
Marvelous. A very different question. Someone asked, what are the three of you seeing in terms of hiring trends and the overall need for talent under you or side by side with you in corporate communications? Are there skills that you desperately want in your department or in your company, but you can't find? Whitney, Molly, either of you?
I will say, being at a high growth startup, we are making a lot of hires, and something that is different now than before is we're totally open to remotely located workers. I'm here in the Twin Cities. I just hired someone who's based out in Washington, D.C. We have another colleague in the south of Florida, and we work seamlessly together, and it's great. And the opportunity to hire from a much broader talent pool for some of these specialized positions is really a game changer. And the ability to work across multiple time zones, you really can do a handoff and get more done. So I'm super thankful for that.
That's great. Molly, what are your thoughts about hiring, what you need, what you're seeing?
So it's funny you bring that up, Whitney, because I've built my team again remotely in the past 9 months. I will tell you, no one's putting their address on their resumes anymore, which I think is so telling. Whether or not that means they're open to moving or that they're of the philosophy that it doesn't matter. So just as an anecdote, we'll share that.
Molly, would you advise them not to put their address?
I don't know if I'd say don't put it on there. I think just be much more open about really what you're looking for. Are you open to a relo, or are you saying, hey, I'm really darn good and I can do this from anywhere, and let's talk if you're open to that.
Right.
I don't know. I still put mine on there. But I think the other thing that I've started to really see and notice a shift in is actually that transition of people who are leaving journalism and moving into communications. And that can be a really hard transition. I'm sure we've all, whether some of you have done it or have had peers and colleagues who've done that. I will say the talent that I'm seeing from former journalists who are looking to make that move has really evolved. And, they are coming with a much more strategic framework as to what communications is and what they can bring to it, which has been really refreshing because there's obviously a lot of great talent that is making that career shift. So that is a place where I would say I've paid more attention to the people in transition than I probably had in the past.
Fernando at TE, any insights into hiring trends, particularly in marketing and communications that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, I don't have the luxury of hiring too many people these days, but I think the skill sets that I tend to look for when I hire are somebody who has, issues management, crisis communications experience. I think that's very, very key. I think having a digital or data-driven mindset is becoming more and more important in order for us to be able to communicate the return on the investment, and are we focused on the right things? I think we've got individuals on our teams that do a lot of great work, but is that really having the impact that we need? And so being able to measure that, and there's so many communications tools that we've talked about that are digitally driven, being able to sort of mine the data behind that to assess is what I'm doing being effective. I think the other thing that I look for is, because we are a much smaller team, is having somebody who has both that internal and external communications mindset, because the lines between internal and external blurred so much that you can have an external communication strategy targeting your employees, for example. So being able to think both internal and external is is something else that I look for as well.
Oh, that's great. Here's a question, and we've got about 5 more minutes. And wow, thank you for everything that you've covered. Here's an interesting question for any of the 3 of you. If your company's diversity, equity, and inclusion team is all white, how do you ensure that your messaging, internal and external, is authentic, hits the mark, when the members of the DE&I communications team may not have the personal experience to back it up? Any of the 3 of you, how do you communicate and truly empathize, particularly in the diversity and inclusion arena?
I'll jump in really quick, and I'll be quick and leave more time for Molly and Whitney to expand on it. But we do have I would say a pretty diverse communications team at corporate. But the other thing that we have found valuable is working closely with our ERGs to see, is what we're planning on working on, does that resonate? Is it true? Is it authentic? And how can we make it more authentic? So I think tapping into, partnering with your ERGs can be a valuable strategy as part of your communications around that topic.
That's great. Whitney, Molly, any thoughts? And of course, it isn't necessarily just African-American. It can also be, if there's a team that's dealing with issues relating to women employees, are they a team that actually understands the needs of women employees? So how do you make sure that your diversity, equity, and inclusion communications efforts are authentic? Whitney, Molly?
I think you need to bring diversity into your team. I think you need to acknowledge that maybe it's not set up for success with a limited view, and there are external partners. There are a lot of ways of assembling a team that has a broader view of the world. And, think about it. If we were forming an accounting group and there wasn't an accountant on the team, you would all look around and be like, hey, no one knows about accounting. Maybe we should bring in people who are experts in this area. I mean, this is a discipline with people who have specialties and expertise. It's okay to acknowledge that that doesn't exist and to seek that and bring that on board.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is redefine the concept of your team. While the people who have those roles might be in those roles, I talked about being the truth teller earlier. You got to find your people across your organization who have the experience, and will tell you the real deal.
That's outstanding. We'll do a lightning round, and any of the 3 of you can jump in with a short answer. Crisis communications. If companies did not have a crisis communications plan before March of 2020, they sure as heck should have one now to deal with unemployment, layoffs, just everything beyond just the medical issues of the pandemic. What are your predictions in 2021 for the urgency of having a robust crisis communications plan, particularly for those companies that didn't think they needed one? What's the role of crisis planning for you in CorpCom in 2021?
Paul, let me jump in, and I'm going to indirectly answer the question because it's something that's been on my mind, and it popped up when you said this. I have a background, a lot of experience in issues in crisis communications, whether it's airplane accidents, shareholder lawsuits, product recalls, coming under scrutiny by political leaders around the world for company practices. So I understand issues in crisis, and you're constantly learning. One of the things that I've seen in the past year when I've looked at resumes is, I think most communicators have been involved in supporting COVID communications. Because you've worked on COVID, it doesn't make you an expert in crisis communications or issues management. And I've seen a lot of resumes lately where people are saying they're touting their issues and crisis communications experience and pegging that to COVID, right? But when you dig a little bit more, they don't really have much beyond that. So I think one of the concerns I would have is having that false sense of confidence that because you got through COVID, you're now an expert in crisis communications. And that's not the case. So again, not directly the question that you asked, but it's a thought that came to my mind when you raised that.
That's so helpful. Molly, Whitney, crisis communications, is it going to be part of your job in 2021?
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Fernando said, I've had, certainly a number of crises that I've worked on in my career. And it's been interesting over the past year. A lot of people have asked, were those harder, or has COVID been harder? And without question, the other crises were harder because you are alone, you're under a spotlight, everyone is looking at you, and often everyone is assuming your company did something wrong. We've all been in this boat together, so couldn't agree more. I think when I think about crisis planning going forward, there's kind of two things. There is we've all had crisis plans for this event, that event, this event. I view those more as we need to understand what are the rules of the road so we don't create further trouble. So what are the things you have to do so you don't run afoul of the law? That needs to be documented. You should know that. On the other side of it, it is more of a philosophy of how you as a company are going to approach, who are the decision makers, what are the key things, like, again, keeping you grounded in your purpose, what you believe, because that will help guide the decisions. It's less about write the press release in advance. That kind of stuff is kind of out the window, in my opinion.
Whitney, anything to add?
I agree, Molly. Create your process, understand who the stakeholders are, who's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, figure that out, and then plan for fewer scenarios, because inevitably you'll plan for 5 and it will be number 110 that hits you. Work your process, work your owners, and then, prepare accordingly for anything that could happen.
And last question before we break for all three of you. We have a question that I'll merge with another question. A question came in from a guest. How is the communications field looking in 2021 with this economy? Obviously, someone is considering a career in corporate communications, or you could answer this question: what final advice do you have for our audience listening as corporate communicators going into the maw of 2021? So answer it either as what's the communications field looking like from a career standpoint, or what advice in general do you have for corporate communicators? Molly, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the industry is, from what I see, continues to be strong, but very much evolving. It is, Fernando touched on this earlier, it is less pure PR person, pure internal comms. Really the people who are standing out right now have that strategic cross-functional ability to move and think about planning. I think if I were to give a piece of advice, which I've done this really well sometimes and really terribly sometimes, but it's been a focus for me this past year, is invest in your network. It has been so easy for people to, again, sitting in our houses, drop off and just kind of head down to our jobs. And really being intentional. I think we're also lonely, that people are like, sure, I'll do a virtual coffee with you. I've never met you. That'd be great. And so I would really encourage people to continue to build time into doing that.
That is so smart. Whitney?
Develop comfort with having difficult conversations. There's a book that you can buy that I think is called Difficult Conversations, but it will serve you well. And I think that what COVID has taught many of us is being comfortable with the uncomfortable and thriving in spite of immense challenges. But if you haven't yet developed that thick iron skin, it's a skill that will reap, rich dividends for you as time goes on. Small or big crisis, the ability to have an honest, collaborative conversation with people in positions of leadership is really essential.
Outstanding. Fernando, your final advice to corporate communicators or people who wish they were corporate communicators?
I think Molly hit it squarely. Network, invest in that, reach out, build those relationships. The other thing that I'm seeing and hearing is the market is starting to, turn up a little bit more. There is more hiring from what I'm hearing from folks in my networks. It may not be the level that you're looking for. I think your entry level, your mid-senior, your mid-level positions, even some senior positions, there are a lot of opportunities. probably less, the top roles, for example, but that'll, from what I'm hearing, over the next 12 months, that should begin to, you know, maybe be a little bit more optimistic. So again, yeah, I just think it depends on the various levels that folks might be looking for and availability there.
Marvelous. This brings us to the end of today's Sharper Angle event. There will be another one in a couple of weeks that we'll let you know about. It's brought to you by Maccabee Public Relations in Minneapolis. Thank you to everybody who joined us and listened in today. And of course, a very special thanks to our panelists, Molly, Fernando, and Whitney, for sharing your very candid and very refreshingly frank insights. We so appreciate your being here today. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, everybody, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.